Hello, I'm Ayi Makaraig. Welcome to Rappler Talk. The Philippines versus China is the most important and closely watched development in the South China Sea dispute. This week, Manila presents oral arguments on jurisdiction at the Arbitral Tribunal in The Hague. The Philippines expects to win, but some analysts believe the historic arbitration case is a gambit that's not a slam dunk. Joining us is Professor J. Batong Bacal, Director of the University of the Philippines Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. Welcome to Rappler.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, Professor J, 2 years ago, you wrote a thought leader's piece for Rappler where you described the case as an idealistic gambit. You compared it to Don Quixote and the windmill, David versus Goliath. 2 years later, do you still hold the same view?
Oh yes, definitely. Because after all, we're still the same weaker country compared to China. It's still the strongest power in the region, and it's growing. And in fact, it has demonstrated that by undertaking all of these activities since then.
Reclamation,
forcing our fishermen off of our fishing grounds, confronting our navy. So you can really see that the disparity in size, the asymmetry in power is really coming into play now, despite the arbitration.
So this week, the tribunal decided to hold oral arguments on the topic of jurisdiction. So they say there are two parts to the case, jurisdiction and merits. Let's talk about jurisdiction. What are the challenges for the Philippine delegation in defending that the tribunal has jurisdiction or the power to hear the case?
Well, jurisdiction is determined here by the case which is presented, and the views of the tribunal. They have to be convinced that the disputes brought before them by the Philippines are disputes that are within their power to adjudicate or arbitrate under the terms of the UNCLOS. And that really now depends on how the Philippines has constructed basically its case. And unfortunately, the details of that we do not know because the memorial has been kept confidential so far.
The pleading.
Yes. But based on descriptions and reports, of course, we know that there are at least three principal claims that are being made.
Right.
The first one, of course, is with respect to the so-called 9-dash line. We are arguing that the claims of China, which are manifested in this expansive 9-dash line claim, are invalid under international law and did not survive the entry into force of UNCLOS. A second set of claims that is with respect to the maritime features, the entitlements, so-called, the kinds of rights that China is asserting based on the disputed features. We are saying that they have violated international law in claiming excessive rights. And the third one concerns all the other activities. It's like a catch-all. But basically, they revolve around the fact that China is preventing the Philippines from exercising its rights in its maritime zone, especially our own exclusive economic zone.
So let's focus on jurisdiction because this seems to be the main claim or argument of China, that the tribunal does not have the power to try the case. And it cites two issues, territorial sovereignty and maritime boundary delimitation.
Yes.
The argument of China is that since our case tackles these two issues, these are outside the scope of the tribunal. So how do you think the Philippines would be able to respond to that?
Well, we have tried to trying to convince the tribunal that all these claims that we presented are only issues of interpretation and application of the convention. And that means that these are only issues pertaining to the maritime arena, the waters adjacent to these land territories. What China is trying to argue is that these two cannot be separated. You cannot decide on the maritime rights unless you decide the sovereignty over the adjacent land territories. We, on the other hand, are taking the position that they can be separated. So the difficulty really lies in that divide, because conventionally or normally, whenever maritime issues are presented to international tribunals, they first have to determine who has sovereignty over the adjacent land features before they can move on to the adjacent waters, because the principle, the land dominates the sea, I think that has been thrown about quite a lot lately. That is actually what that is actually the foundation of UNCLOS. So
Okay.
all the maritime zones, the rights that states are able to exercise in waters depending on distance from the shore, are based on that principle that all of that is because they flow from the adjacent land.
Okay, so
Okay.
are you saying that we must first determine who owns these maritime features, whether it's a rock or an island, before we would be able to say or to determine the like the 200 EEZ,
Yes.
200 nautical mile EEZ?
Yes, that is what China is arguing because that really is the way that UNCLOS was set up.
Okay.
On the other hand, we are trying to argue that interpretation and application of the convention, especially here in our area in the South China Sea, that can be done with respect only to the maritime rights. We do not have to decide the sovereignty over the features. That's why the Philippines expressly excluded the issue of territorial sovereignty from its claims.
Okay. Justice Scarpio, in an interview with Rappler, said that if the Philippines wins the issue of jurisdiction, then that's already a certainty or a likelihood that the tribunal will strike down the 9-dash line, which is under the merits of the case. Do you subscribe to that view?
Well, Justice Carpio is correct that assuming we're able to surmount the issue of jurisdiction, meaning we convince the tribunal that they can rule on this case, then the first major issue, of course, that we're presenting is the validity of this 9-dash line claim.
That's the
From
main
all,
issue.
Yes, because from all accounts, although there is some problems, of course, because this is China trying to justify its 9-dash line claim. But from all of its statements, it seems that the 9-dash lines is fundamentally based on some concept of historic rights or historic title. That is what is coming out from the different statements. But the whole point of negotiating UNCLOS back in the 1970s and 80s was precisely to eliminate those types of claims because back in those times, many states were claiming vast amounts of waters, anywhere from 3, 12, 24, even 350 nautical miles distance from the shore, and on many different grounds, including historic grounds. So China's claim falls under that category, and we're arguing that the claim, that 9-dash line claim, cannot stand at present. It is invalid and illegitimate under the current state of international law.
Okay, let's go to now the sequence. Since the tribunal decided to first tackle jurisdiction before going to the merits, what does that mean? Like, are they going to rule on jurisdiction first before going to the merits, and what are the scenarios?
Yes. Based on the press release of the tribunal, the last one, which was issued a couple of months ago, they decided to separate the issue of jurisdiction and admissibility as a preliminary question. That's how they describe it. And under the rules of procedure of the tribunal, they have to decide that first before going into the merits.
Okay.
The scenarios, therefore, either they rule that they can rule that they have jurisdiction on all the claims. They can rule that they don't have any jurisdiction at all, or it is possible that they will divide the case into the different claims of the Philippines and say that there's jurisdiction in some, but not in others. Okay. Given that the case presented by the Philippines is rather complicated, there are at least 13 to a little less than 20 claims, I think, depending on how you count them. If you read through the statement and notification claim, I think it's realistic to expect that at least the tribunal might come up with a decision, a mixed decision, saying that they have jurisdiction on some but not on others.
Okay. But the worst case scenario would be to say they do not have jurisdiction.
Yes, that would be
all.
the worst case scenario. And that can happen if they are convinced of China's arguments, really, that the issues cannot be separated. The sovereignty over the land cannot be separated from the maritime features, and therefore the maritime rights and jurisdictions cannot also be decided unless they first go into sovereignty over the land. That is the worst case scenario for the Philippines.
Let's talk about the development in the past months, which is really China's massive reclamation in the very features
Yes.
that we raised in our case.
Yes.
How do you think it affects our case? You mentioned previously that it's like tampering with
Yes.
evidence.
Yes. Well, you have to make distinctions now between the different locations of these features because there are 7 locations. And some of them are within 200 nautical miles of the Philippines, others are beyond 200 nautical miles. This is important because the position we have taken in the case is that we're entitled to only 200 nautical miles as our exclusive economic zone. And if that is so, then beyond 200 nautical miles, that's the exclusive, that is the high seas.
High seas.
It is a
For
commons
all.
for all. And the thing is, there are provisions in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea which actually recognize that states can create artificial islands in the high seas.
Okay.
The only exception is that if those high seas are actually also part of the continental shelf of a coastal state, the extended continental shelf, similar to what we have in Benham Rice.
Okay.
But we don't have that. We don't have that kind of claim right now in the South China Sea. So 3 of these Chinese possessions are actually beyond 200 nautical miles. And although we have contested their legality and we're asking the tribunal to declare that they are not part of China's continental shelf, if they're regarded by the tribunal as being part of the high seas, then it doesn't actually help us. Because China, just like any other state, would be able to say that they can establish these islands in the high seas.
Okay.
And that's under our own theory. So that really is a problem. Now, for islands within these reclamations within 200 nautical miles, and that includes places like Mischief Reef, which is one of the closest.
Yes.
These are areas within our exclusive economic zone in continental shelf. So in those places, then we do have a chance of contesting their legality, because we could assert that if we're successful in convincing the tribunal that they are within our exclusive economic zone in continental shelf, and that none of the other island features in that area can generate such a shelf or zone, then we could then ask for the tribunal to say that they are at least inconsistent or they are in violation of international law because they are constructions on somebody else's exclusive economic zone in continental shelf.
Okay, let's go to a question from a Twitter user at I am that Lex here. This is actually a very important question. What do you intend to achieve with this effort if, when we get a favorable ruling, do we expect China to abide by it? Precisely the issue of enforcement.
Yes. Well, it is true that in any international tribunal, any case before international tribunal, there is no independent enforcement body. So you cannot go to the sheriff or the police or some other executive agency to have them enforce it against the opponent. International arbitrations and adjudications have always relied on state consent, if it's between states. So here there is no way by which we can actually force China to comply. But I think really what is intended is for the rules to be clarified, meaning for there to be a definitive and final declaration on what maritime zones apply in any particular place in the South China Sea, particularly whether we are entitled to more rights because it is in our maritime zones rather than China's maritime zones. If the 9-dash line is invalid, then they'll have to measure these maritime zones from land. They'll have to also hopefully abide by the characterization of the tribunal of the different features.
Rock or island.
Which would help, therefore, us in the future, hopefully, in negotiating some other arrangement. So ultimately, it's about reinforcing your argument, your negotiating position when you do come to that point that you do have to discuss with them, how you do have to negotiate with them on the exercise of rights in any particular area.
What's your take on, like Justice Carpio and other analysts and the Philippine government say that it's moral suasion that will get China to comply with a ruling favorable to the Philippines? You know, that shame, being embarrassed in the global arena, that China is a rising superpower, it cannot afford to defy international law.
I would rather talk about it in terms of moral suasion rather than naming and shaming, because one, when you talk about shaming a country into submission, I don't think that will work, especially with China. That's clearly not going to work based on how they've acted so far. Embarrassing them only makes them dig in even harder, no? Even deeper into their possessions.
Do reclamation.
Yes, like the reclamation. But moral suasion in the sense that a clear statement that these are the rules that everyone should follow in the international community, that would certainly have some kind of influence over the long term. States do place importance on their stature and their reputation in the international community, because that is what allows them to, get concessions. That is what allows them to get agreements from partners, etc. So you can't really work in an international community if everybody's suspicious about your intentions and your reliability. So that over the long term, that is, I think, possible.
Okay.
The only question is how long will that take?
Yeah. In your estimation, do you see this taking? Well, Justice Carpio says a decade.
I guess that's an optimistic.
That's optimistic.
Yeah, because, well, from what we can see with China, it takes, they make decisions and take actions over a much longer period of time.
They have a plan.
Yeah, I mean, look at their plan to become first world, or to equal America's stature economically and militarily. It's a 100-year plan, and they actually have a schedule up to 2049. That's how long term they plan. So in terms of action, you could expect similar spread. Their leadership changes are every 10 years. So it really takes a long time for policies to change.
On day 2 of the oral arguments, the Philippines brought up environmental and fishing claims, and this is something you've written about extensively. How does the environmental damage figure into our arguments? How does it boost or affect our arguments?
Well, the activities that China has undertaken, asserting itself unilaterally, a lot of it, and part of the reason why we complain so hard about it is that because they're destructive, environmentally destructive. We're not talking only about fishing beyond a certain limit or merely fishing without a permit. We're talking of extracting corals, extracting marine turtles. I mean, these are species, these are resources that once you take them, they're gone forever in that manner. So we're also much more concerned about sustainability of these resources, the environmental sustainability. So we're hoping that also adds basically to impress upon the tribunal the need to really take action, to really take jurisdiction and issue the appropriate rulings, because the way that China is exploiting the resources of the South China Sea is already unsustainable and rather destructive, and that's just for its own uses. What more
not for other countries?
Yeah, what more for the other countries? Nothing will be left for them, and that's what we're really worried about. Even if China did not, say, militarily take these areas, the fact that its activities are so massive and destructive is already a cause for great concern.
Let's go to the Philippines strategy as a whole. Many scholars who are critical of arbitration say that it seems the Philippines put all of its eggs in the legal basket, the legal track, to the detriment of, say, bilateral negotiations with China or trade relations. What do you think the Philippines should do moving forward, especially after arbitration?
Moving forward, I think we really should review what we've done in the past couple of years, and it really seems to have happened that Philippine-China relations since 2012 have been dominated basically by the arbitration. I mean, you can see it in the papers. It's always about the arbitration and almost nothing about, say, cultural ties or trade, etc. I mean, and everything else seems to have stopped because of that. When you think about it, this is still the region's fastest growing economy. It is still going to be the region's most powerful military most militarily powerful state in the region. So you cannot ignore that. While we, on the other hand, will always be limited by our size, the
Yes.
smaller population, and the more limited amount of resources that we have. So for us, we really should be taking advantage of all available options and not unnecessarily limiting ourselves to only one or two. We really need to diversify in a sense in order for us to maximize whatever benefits we can get from each and every option. So that includes bilateral negotiations if necessary, but that doesn't necessarily preclude, say, multilateral negotiations on another front, or
ASEAN.
even arbitration again if we feel that is necessary on another issue.
Okay.
Use of ASEAN, use of military alliances, use of bilateral alliances. We should make use of all of them, really. No, the only thing, really, the only problem probably or challenge there is that we need to make sure that when we make use of all of them, they are all coordinated and all
Consistent.
directed, yes,
Yeah.
consistent, directed towards one particular goal. No? And that goal must be long-term, and that goal must always be for the benefit of the country.
Do you think we're there yet?
Well, given our politics, actually, I think we're still quite a ways from it. In fact, I'm with a group of academics who feel that we're still not at the point where we have long-term strategies, where we have careful, deliberate actions that can cross beyond the changes in
The
administration.
administration.
That's really our problem. No?
Okay. Since you mentioned that, now it's being raised now a lot with talk of the elections in the Philippines. Well, so far, Vice President Binay is the only politician to officially declare his presidential candidacy, and he's become very controversial for his stand on China. He is supportive of a joint venture, joint development of resources. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think it contradicts the current administration's policy?
Well, first of all, just start from the basics. Joint development, joint management of resources. When it comes to the oceans, the resources of the oceans, even the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea promotes joint management, joint development of resources, especially in disputed areas. This is because of the recognition that ocean resources are different from land resources. These are shared resources, and what you do in one part of the ocean could affect another part of it. So that's why shared management, shared development makes sense. Okay. Now, in the South China Sea, the problem we have is that these competing territorial claims are overshadowing the ideas of shared resources, the commons character of the oceans. So that right now, everyone, China, us, even other countries, don't seem to think of the resources in South China Sea as shared resources. It's always about our own exclusive resources that we're worrying about. I think that's one problem.
Okay.
When it comes to the efforts in the Philippines, our specific problem is that our experience so far in a joint development in the South China Sea related to the dispute is the JMSU.
Yes, under Arroyo.
Under Arroyo, which has been tainted with corruption
Yes.
allegations, and that is really unfortunate. No? And because of that, that has set the current administration against any consideration of any kind of joint development. But in the future, assuming that it is free from corruption, the big question, the big challenge will be to make sure that any kind of arrangement like that would be fair and equitable to the parties concerned, especially to us because we're the weaker party in this situation, we're the smaller one, and yet we have a greater need for those resources. The other one is larger and has other options. So fairness and equitability will be the main concern, I think, there, in addition to transparency, basically, and lack of absence of corruption. If it's under those conditions, then I think it would still be worth to explore that option, at least.
Okay.
No? Because really, the only other alternative will be exactly what's happening now, which is each country trying to get its own exclusive share, and in that situation, definitely we will lose because the other country will always have the advantage in terms of strength, in terms of capacity and capability.
Okay. Lastly, let's go to the wider international community. So there's a question from at Eggy Marie. Can we expect the support of the US and ASEAN countries since they're also protecting their bilateral relations with China? And in relation to that, we saw countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Japan observe the hearing. So
Yes.
what are the wider implications to the international community?
I think what we need to pay attention to will be the common interest, really, between us and the international community, and that is an interest in making sure that the South China Sea remains a commons, remains accessible to all for their own specific purposes. So, for example, the United States is interested in it because of its freedom of navigation interest. No? Other countries like Europe, of course, will also be similarly situated because their ships also pass through for purposes of trade. Our neighboring countries, on the other hand, have similar interests in navigation, etc. Although they do have their
Some
own
have
exclusive
claims, yeah.
interest, their own claims, right? That's the point at which we will diverge, I guess. Now, I think we will see the support, continuing support of the international community for as long as our position also benefits them in those terms, in accordance, as long as it coincides with their interests.
Mutual interest.
Yes, their mutual interests, which is actually how the world works.
Yeah.
You'll
How
not support
politics works.
anybody who's going to act against you, would you? So that's the thing. We need to review carefully and appreciate exactly where our interests converge,
Okay.
and therefore have expectations based on those shared interests. With respect to divergent interests and exclusive interests, we also have to realize, however, that on those aspects, we're on our own.
Okay.
We have to accept that, and we should therefore work on those exclusive interests based on our own actions and our own resources, and not rely on somebody else to do it for us.
On allies.
Yes,
and
even
partners.
allies. Even allies work only on the basis of shared interests.
And
You
by-
cannot expect them to do things for you.
By
because
that
it
you
is-
mean military, build up military
Yes.
capability.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
even military. So one of our long-standing issues has always been an over-reliance on
Yes.
allies for things that we really should be doing only ourselves. Yeah,
On the
so,
US.
Yes.
Now Japan.
Yes.
We have
So
Australia.
hopefully we get away from that kind of attitude from now on, and realize that their allies are good for only some of the things you want to do or we need to do. For the rest, we should always keep it to ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. That's our conversation with Professor J. Batong Bakal of the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. I'm Ai Makaraig for Rappler Talk. Thank you for joining us.